Hi, everyone. Welcome to this. Thank you all for coming. This is the second edition of our book chat. And so we have Alex Ross here with us today, and we'll talk about him a little bit, then he'll talk. But I just want to remind you of a few other things. The first one is we have more of these book chats. So on December 3rd, we have Emily Wilson coming to talk. She's going to read to us from her as yet unpublished translation of the Iliad, which is going to be amazing. We also have some writers lined up for the spring. We have Claudia Rankin, who will come and read to us. And we have the art historian Hal Foster, who's going to come. And so it should be really fun. We also have the next concert in our concert series is November 21st. And that is the piano master Matthew Shipp. Unfortunately, that will be online as everything else is in our lives, but the connection to us is he will actually be playing live from Wolfenson Hall. So, but we're not going to have an audience for him, but that's where he will be. So at least, you know, we will know that psychically he is a little close to us. I think what's going to happen is that Alex is going to talk a little bit, and then Alex and I will talk a little bit, and then there will be questions. So if you have questions, and I really hope you will, you should start thinking about them right now. Just write in the chat that you have a question. You don't have to tell me what it is, and I'll just call on people in the order in which you sign up in the chat. Please make sure your mute is muted until the moment when it is you're asking a question or something. And now, without further ado, I'm really happy to introduce to you Alex Ross. Alex is one of the great music writers of our day. And I just have an example for you of how great he is as a music writer and how influential and meaningful he is. You know, he's the head critic at the New Yorker, but his last book was a book about music in the 20th century called The Rest is Noise. And after that book came out, I went on tour to England, and I realized that the South Bank Centre, one of the major performing centers in London, had dedicated an entire season, an entire year, to playing the music that was referenced in this book. So that's an amazing way for words and practice to exist in the world. This book, I'm going to show it to you. Wagnerism is about the effect of Wagner in the world, the history and thought, and what it means and what people have thought it meant. And without further ado, I'm really happy. Alex Ross.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much, David, for the very kind introduction. And I'm very happy to be among you virtually, although of course I would much prefer to be with you physically in the magnificent surroundings of the Institute. But such is the reality. We are locked in at the moment. But it's a wonderful opportunity to talk to such an elite audience about my work. And so I thought I'd begin with a general presentation of the book and what led me to write it. And then I'd love to have a chance to chat with David one-on-one for a bit, because I'm actually particularly curious about how you, David, look at Wagner. And I chatted with John Adams a few weeks ago on the same topic, and I think it's just fascinating how composers themselves view this titanic, complex, troubling predecessor. And I think it'll be particularly good to focus there on music. Suddenly I'm filling my own screen in a slightly alarming way, so let me get rid of that. Because my book is actually not really about Wagner's music or indeed about his life at all. Of course, he is present in it throughout. He's named God knows how many times from beginning to end. And there are substantial sections, especially at the beginnings of the early chapters, describing in a general way certain of his major works as a way of introducing those readers who are not already well acquainted with Wagner to some of the very rudimentary aspects of his achievement before going on to discuss his impact on the world outside music. Now, why did I choose to do this? Of course, Wagner's effect on music is an extraordinarily rich subject in itself. Would be worthy of a book in itself, and that's the problem. I think if I tried to take on everything, including music, I would have had a book vastly longer than the already quite long, nearly 800-page book that I produced. But I think also the topic of Wagner's musical influence is not as interesting, not as striking, not as singular as that of his extra musical influence. Because inside the world of music, Wagner was undoubtedly a very major figure, a hugely influential figure, a kind of a paradigm shifting phenomenon in musical history in many ways. But I would not argue, certainly, that he was more influential than any number of other figures. Indeed, I think you might be able to argue that that Monteverdi, Bach, Beethoven, perhaps Stravinsky, and others were ultimately more influential in terms of their reverberating influence through a generation after generation. Wagner had a relatively brief period where he was just ubiquitous. One composer after another was going through a Wagnerian period. And then it subsided quite substantially in the early 20th century. Wagner remains a fascinating figure. And again, I'd love to talk to David about this, but probably in a more oblique way for many composers living now, more tangential way. But outside of music, we see a phenomenon that I think is almost unprecedented in cultural history. A composer becoming the center of the impulse toward a widespread, if very vaguely defined, movement through all the arts. This movement that has been labeled for some time now Wagnerism. One that certainly had its heyday as in music at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, but has continued to reverberate into the present day. And I thought this was a story really worth concentrating on. Why exactly did Wagner have such a sudden and huge and widespread influence in the arts and literature? And I look more widely than that. I look at really Wagner's overall social and cultural profile, his effect on intellectual life in the widest sense, including philosophy. And of course, I talk about Wagner's political ramifications, which are inseparable from his artistic ramifications, because Wagner was an absolutely unalterably political artist and cannot be separated from the political sphere. But really the heart of the book is the effect on arts and literature. And so why did this happen? And what was the scope of it, and how did it evolve through several generations? And I thought it was very much worth doing because there is actually no extant book, not only in English, but in most other languages, that has attempted to put the entirety of this phenomenon into a single text. There are many, many wonderful studies of one aspect or another of this phenomenon. Of course, Wagner in Germany has been studied at great length. There's an excellent anthology edited by David Large and William Weber on Wagnerism in European culture and politics, also with some consideration of America as well. There are many studies of French Wagnerism, which was really the flashpoint for this upwelling of Wagnerian influence in the arts. There are entire books written about Wagner's relationship with individual figures. Timothy Martin's book on Joyce and Wagner, Heath Lees's book on Mallarmé and Wagner, Rosamund Bartlett's book on Wagner in Russia. So a fairly substantial library, also a number of essay collections on this topic. But no one has really been foolish enough to attempt to put all of this together in a single volume. I should mention also Wagner in Hollywood, Wagner and film history. There's an excellent collection of essays, Wagner in cinema, on that topic. So I thought I would take on this this perhaps impossible task of putting together all of these multiple, proliferating, contradictory Wagnerisms and see what patterns I could perceive and simply try to encompass the entire history of it. So that is what I did, beginning in 2008, 2009, and just finishing this year. A fairly mammoth undertaking that involved, first of all, just an enormous amount of reading. I read hundreds upon hundreds of books, wide swaths of literature, either reading or rereading Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Thomas Mann, Proust, D.H. Lawrence, Joseph Conrad, Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Villiers de l'Isle Adam, the list goes on and on, as well as looking at painting. When I was traveling for the New Yorker, I would regularly go to different museums just to see what I might stumble upon, heading especially toward there's usually a kind of symbolist or Art Nouveau sort of Jugendstil kind of gallery. And very often there would be sort of one or two sort of weird, creepy Wagnerian paintings on display in such a room, because that was really the high watermark of Wagnerism in the arts, the 1890s. Looking at buildings, thinking about architecture, going to see several of Louis Sullivan's beautiful jewel box banks in the upper Midwest, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Sullivan being a devout Wagnerite. And a summer spent watching film, dozens upon dozens of movies, including some very strange offbeat ones, looking at the extensive history of Wagner's music in Hollywood, Wagnerian themes, Wagner himself as a character in film, and on and on. And then there was a question of, after several years of immersion, beginning to organize this vast amount of material and shaping a narrative out of it, because I knew it was going to be a large field of research going into it, and then it turned out to be even larger than I imagined. A couple points in the process, I came upon this volume, for example, Timothée Picard's Dictionnaire encyclopédique Wagner, which is 2,600 pages long, an extraordinary catalog of their entries devoted to each Wagner opera, everyone that Wagner ever met, the characters, vast number of Wagner singers, as well as literary and artistic figures. And given the French focus of the book, although it is completely international, but there's a heavy concentration on French figures, I started discovering novelists who I'd simply never heard of. Marcel Batillard and his novel Cher Mystique, which is about two tubercular lovers. Well, she has tuberculosis, and the man sleeps with her constantly in the hope of getting tuberculosis. And they are constantly listening to Wagner. And they have a cat whom they name Klingzor, and she dies. And then there's this deeply disturbing dream sequence where he is having some kind of amorous encounter with her decomposing corpse. Absolutely disgusting scene that I quoted a considerable passage from in the book, just for the purposes of thoroughness. And so it just went on and on and on. So it's the question of organizing, taming this pile of material. And so what I came up with was a structure that was partly chronological, partly geographical, and partly thematic. I begin with Wagner himself, and I introduce the ring cycle, go through the history of the ring cycle, which really gives you a good measure of Wagner's biography and Wagner's intellectual history and intellectual development. And then I bring in Nietzsche, and the tension between Wagner and Nietzsche opens up many of the major themes of the book, because as Nietzsche backs away from Wagner, he becomes, unfortunately, all the more Wagnerian. He really becomes an early instance of Wagnerism as I define it, because he's not simply a slavish fan interpreting the music according to Wagner's own strictures. He is offering a radical reinterpretation, a revisionist idea of Wagner, and thereby reinventing Wagner for his own purposes in a critical mode, but nonetheless grounded in a lasting, abiding passion for the music. And this is the pattern, this kind of early immersion in Wagner, followed by a degree of detachment or perhaps outright rejection, in which Wagner's work undergoes a transmutation and is, in a sense, transported into the world of the spectator and changes into something else. And you see this a number of times throughout the narrative. Something quite similar happens in terms of James Joyce's relationship with Wagner, or Virginia Woolf's relationship with Wagner. And so the need to escape Wagner's shadow, and so often young people of this period went through this early stage of deep infatuation with Wagner, but in getting out from under that shadow while holding on to elements of the work, this is how these perspectives on Wagner proliferate and take so many diverse forms. So that sort of introduces the sequence. The second chapter is devoted to French Wagnerism, which you see early signs of French Wagnerism sort of already in the 1840s and 1850s. Gérard de Nerval was interested in Wagner, but the real flashpoint is Baudelaire. Baudelaire's extraordinary 1861 essay, Richard Wagner in Tannhäuser in Paris, which is a masterwork of creative criticism, a manifesto in some sense of Baudelaire's artistic philosophy as refracted through the material of the Wagner operas. And it is a radical interpretation of Wagner. The way he talks about Tannhäuser perceiving elements of a counter-religion, a satanic religion in Tannhäuser, in particular the Venusberg sequences, is not at all what Wagner had in mind, as far as the evidence suggests. But it was real to Baudelaire. He saw his own preoccupations reflected strongly in the work and in a sense, amplified back at him. And so that is another instance of this kind of the sort of reinvention of Wagner in the minds of his admirers, not at all a detachment or a rejection, or in this case, Baudelaire was absolutely infatuated with the work, but nonetheless, he transforms it into something quite different. What's quite interesting about that relationship is Wagner read the essay and was appreciative of it, even though he must have felt uneasy about some aspects of this interpretation. And so it goes on from there, and Wagnerism explodes in France, thanks certainly in part to Baudelaire's enthusiasm, but I think it quite naturally appears with many French painters. Gauguin, Cézanne were very interested in Wagner, with subsequent literary figures, Villiers de l'Isle Adam, Mallarmé, and Odilon Redon is a very important painter who engaged with Wagner. And so this emergence of an avant-garde, bohemian, experimental, subversive, countercultural vision of Wagner, blending with ideas about dream states, the unconscious, kind of extreme sensuality, sort of a liberation of sensual impulses. Also this preoccupation with the occult and the mystical. I spent some time on the extraordinary figure of Josephin Pélédan and his wild novels, several of which are on Wagnerian themes, interspersed with his Rosicrucian and other mystical preoccupations. And so that's a kind of a festival of kind of decadence in France. It's quite different when I turn in subsequent chapters to Wagner in the British Isles and Wagner in America. A much more idealistic vision of Wagner, a genteel Wagner intermixing with Victorian themes, legendary Arthurian themes, the phenomenon of Parsifal at the Met in 1903, and this great fad for Wagner that was reached its climax at that point. And then eventually, Germany. I choose to delay the focus on Germany until the 5th chapter, although of course we began in Germany with Wagner and Nietzsche, but I wanted to sort of give a tour of the horizon of these other international Wagnerisms before turning back to Wagner and beginning to confront the political problem, Wagner and nationalism, Wagner and anti-Semitism in the Kaiserreich period especially. The shift is toward a kind of more thematic, there's 2 chapters that follow that are more thematic in nature, Wagner and race, where I talk about Wagner's anti-Semitism, I talk about Jewish Wagnerians, and then I talk about African-American Wagnerism, which is a perhaps surprising topic, but a not insubstantial one, thanks to W.E.B. Du Bois's enthusiasm for Wagner and the extraordinary story on a Lohengrin theme that he included in The Souls of Black Folk. And then there follows a chapter on Wagner and gender and sexuality, making the point that Wagner became a potent symbol for a liberated sexuality, for an emergent alternative sexual identity. Early proponents of gay rights were often Wagner enthusiasts. A liking for Wagner was seen as a kind of a code for being gay in many cases. And Wagner was admired by a number of feminist authors and thinkers because of the strength of certain of his female characters, notwithstanding the fact that Wagner himself was a misogynist in many ways, and the the idea of a feminist interpretation of the operas is very much up for debate. But nonetheless, there was this historical event of feminists taking inspiration from Wagner. And that leads into the chapter on Willa Cather, which is the only chapter concentrated entirely on a single figure. But there's something so singular and potent, I think, about Willa Cather's involvement with Wagner that I thought it was worth devoting an entire chapter to it. And perhaps I can get into that more if people are interested. From then on, the focus is more chronological and more political. I have chapters on Wagner during the First World War, and the battle over camps on the left and the right over the meaning of the work in the political arena, intermixed with an account of, as I mentioned, Wagner's relationships with significant early modernist figures in literature and the arts. And there are 2 chapters devoted to that topic. And eventually I arrive at Nazi Germany, which is in some ways the climax of the book. This is the point at which Wagner's reputation takes an irrevocable turn. From then on, Wagner is always going to be associated with Hitler. It's the unavoidable question. It's the first question I've been asked in many cases when I talk about this book. For many people, the one fact that they know about Wagner is that he was Hitler's favorite composer. And I attempt to make a complex argument on this issue, going through the dismaying, dismal history of Wagner in Nazi Germany and showing how Wagner's own political ideas contributed to that weaponization of Wagner in Nazi Germany, while also showing that there were ways in which Wagner was actually less useful, more troubling to the Nazis as an ideological figure, attempting to sort of lead people away from some kind of absolute equation between Wagner and Hitler, who lived in different centuries and were absolutely different people. And perhaps there is an overall agenda behind the book to lead people away from that automatic equation and to show the richness and the extent of this phenomenon of Wagnerism, while also always keeping in mind how the work itself participated in its own misuse, lent a hand to its own misuse. And that's what Thomas Mann said. And that's one of the greatest, sort of most piercing phrases, I think, that has been spoken about this topic. And Thomas Mann, from the beginning to the end of the book, was a sort of spiritual guide for me. I think Mann was the perfect Wagnerite, to take the phrase from George Bernard Shaw, because he was so nuanced, so ambivalent, so unsure, ultimately, of how we should judge this incredibly complex figure, always wavering and yet always passionate and deeply engaged. And so that is sort of how my own relationship with Wagner has shaped up over the years. And wherever possible, I try to do what Thomas Mann would do on any given Wagnerian question. And the book goes to its conclusion with the chapter on Wagner in Hollywood, and a chapter on Wagner since 1945, which is a quite rich field of discussion, even if the kind of golden age of Wagnerism was long past. There's still any number of major figures who contended with Wagner in philosophy, in literature, in the visual arts. I talk about Ingeborg Bachmann, Joseph Beuys, Anselm Kiefer, Philip K. Dick, Theodor Adorno, Alain Badiou, and fantasy culture. I think the relationship of Wagner with modern fantasy culture, J.R.R. Tolkien, the Star Wars movies, the Matrix movies. Everything is in there. Again, it's an issue of, how much could I include without having the book sort of completely break down into a kind of chaos of unalphabetized encyclopedia entries. And my brilliant editor at Forrester Cheroux, Eric Chinsky, worked very hard and very long to attempt to save me from that fate, and urged me to sort of let go of some of the quirky but ultimately extraneous material. And I undoubtedly should have done more in that vein, but I think in the end, I hopefully have written a book that gives a sort of overall map through this landscape, follows certain thematic threads, and is a kind of oblique history of culture from the late 19th century to our present day, following this curious thread of Wagner. And I thought was what's most interesting, just when you look at all these famous figures, whether it's Baudelaire or Proust or Thomas Mann or Kandinsky, Sergei Eisenstein, if you're always sort of looking at them through this curious lens of Wagner, I think it reveals perhaps unsuspected aspects of their personality and their work. And so in the end, for me, it really wasn't a book about Wagner at all. It's a book about this procession of cultural figures, especially at the turn of the last century, and how modernism evolved. I think the origins of modernism is a major thread of the book, and what has been the fate of so-called high culture in the era of world wars and into our present day. So with that, I guess that was a little longer than the 15 or 20 minutes that I projected, but that's what happens with Wagner when just begins to babble. But yes, David, I'd love to
I have a question. I have a bunch of questions for you, but first of all, I was really happy in the book when I got to the Tolkien section, because I read The Lord of the Rings when I was 13. So before I found out about Wagner and about the Ring Cycle, and I remember when I was in high school feeling so excited to find out about the Ring Cycle that a composer had decided to make an opera out of my favorite book. And it was only later I figured out the chronology, but one of the things which is so interesting, and first of all, you've gone through and you've laid out everything in the book. And one thing that I just want to say also is, and I mean this in the best possible way, there's also a gossipy side to this book too, because the fact that Wagner shows up in all of these locations is very amazing. There's sort of the kind of gee whiz, like a Zelig kind of thing that happens in this book, where it's like, oh, pick up W.E. Du Bois. Oh, there's Wagner. Baudelaire, there's Wagner, So it's sort of like everywhere you look. So I guess my first question is, it seems like one of the things you come away with in this book is that Wagner was able to be a kind of mirror to people, which allowed them to see a lot of the things that they were looking for. And not necessarily things about Wagner, but things about themselves and things that they needed. And what do you think made Wagner so useful and so plastic that everyone would be able to find what they wanted there?
Yeah, plastic is a great word. And it is a striking phenomenon because, we don't think at first glance, we don't see Wagner as a mirror, as this very mutable and changeable quantity. He seems so fixed. He's the glowering figure in the Franz von Lenbach portraits. He is the domineering sorcerer of Bayreuth, putting everyone under his spell and supposedly making everyone feel and think the same thing at the same time, subjecting his audiences to this quasi-dictatorial artistic vision. And yet, the book sort of records the precise opposite. The book is a pandemonium of competing interpretations and wild, I'm not going to say misreadings, highly creative readings, transformative readings of this figure, transplanting him into every imaginable different context. And the Black Wagner, the gay Wagner, the feminist Wagner, the Russian Wagner, the Catalan Wagner, the sort of Western American Wagner, it goes on and on. So what is it that sort of causes this effect? I mean, fundamentally, it's what happens with every artwork, especially sort of every important artwork that lasts for any period of time or spreads geographically, inevitably undergoes such mutations and drifts away from the intentions of the creator and the context of the creator's world. So this simply happens, and it is sort of the power of the spectator to change the work in his or her own mind. Or in this case, the power of performers and directors to change the work as it is presented on stage. Another very important aspect of the phenomenon. But there is something sort of especially spectacular about this effect with Wagner. And I think it partly has to do simply with the period and the eagerness, the willingness that so many people had in the late 19th century, especially early 20th century, to look at art as a mode of world revolution and transformation. You know, there's the extraordinary powers that were granted to artists, this religion of art. And Wagner was perhaps the most convincing, the most potent example of such a phenomenon. And many who came after him, I think, were simply envious of the effect that he was having and sort of wanted to replicate it or echo it in some way or another, and to make their own grand Wagnerian gestures. And I would put, again, Joyce in this category. He simply saw Wagner as a rival whom he was going to sort of effectively shove aside, especially with Ulysses fitting its wake as well. But then in the world of the work itself, I think what is so potent, it's partly a musical phenomenon, it's partly this bewitching quality of his music, the orchestration, the flow of motifs through the orchestral texture, the integration of voices into the orchestral texture. It has had this history of sort of putting people into a kind of dream state. And in that state, these visions arise, which are their own visions, amplified and empowered, not Wagner's visions, images of themselves or their future possibility. And then also the mythic aspect. And perhaps this is really ultimately at the core of it, the power of myth. And this is something that Wagner very consciously chose to do as he turned toward the Ring cycle, to set aside historical or semi-historical legendary topics and to leap completely into the realm of myth, knowing that myth, as he understood it, as he analyzed it, never ages. This is what he said. Myth is true for all time, and it contains in condensed form these stories which keep getting told over and over in human history and human culture. And he was actually something of a pioneer in the field of comparative mythology and sort of tracing the common patterns among myths and legends in different cultures and different traditions, and seeing the archetypes, to turn to the Jungian vocabulary, and Jung was quite an admirer of Wagner. And so the way in Parsifal, for example, how he's combining Christian, Buddhist, other sort of East Asian motifs and stories and themes into this kind of master composite of religious ideas. Claude Lévi-Strauss named Wagner the father, the godfather of structural mythology, and it's a plausible claim, you know. And I think if you were to name, if you had to, for me, if I had to single out one quality that sort of ensured Wagner's reach, and it certainly explains, you know, the connection with J.R.R. Tolkien, it is that master manipulation of myth.
I think also the supernatural is really interesting, you know. I think as a part of that is a subset of that, which is that you go to the theater to see something which is unlike your real life. And so you see this thing. I was trying to think as you were talking about other operas I know that were before Wagner, which dealt with that. I guess there's Der Freischütz, you know, which has some of that, you know, feeling that you're involved, you know, you're dealing with the devil. And of course, you know, there's this other kind of world which can't be explained by the things that we know or see. And the music has a relationship too with the Wolfgang music, I guess. But
yeah, of course, I mean, operatic history, there's, you know, endless array of gods, devils, sorceresses, monsters, you know, sort of, you know, the real world kind of breaking open to sort of let these other forces in. I mean, opera lends itself to this kind of, I think, the supernatural, or the sort of whatever transcends kind of daily life. And so
but I can't really think of any other opera composer who's had so many interpretations.
Right.
Well, first of all, so many conflicting interpretations.
Yeah. We'll just sort of pick up this thought, though, in terms of the supernatural. I think something very important that Wagner does is he takes you into a supernatural. Certainly, the Flying Dutchman is a classic supernatural opera, and it is modeled on, you know, it's very much rooted in Der Freischütz and also in Marschner's Der Vampir. It's a vampire story in many ways. The mythic realm of the Ring. There's nothing sort of fully supernatural in Tristan and Isolde except for the potion can be considered some kind of magic implement, but there is certainly a sense there that we're absolutely kind of leaving the everyday world behind. And yet, I think, you know, as these actions transpire, he makes them real. He gives them a kind of psychological richness and depth and immediacy that you forget that all this is supernatural and mythological and sort of implausible and perhaps ridiculous. He makes it come alive. He pulls you in from moment to moment. I mean, I think about how, you know, in Die Walküre, each of the acts of Die Walküre, you know, it's unfolding in real time. The clock is ticking, and there's sort of a sequence of events that it just flows from one moment to another. You're just pulled along so kind of powerfully in this stream, and you're just pulled into the world of these characters. You know, Wotan, most of all, I think the psychology of Wotan in that opera is something tremendous, and it's modern. You know, I mean, I think what Wagner does is this doubling of the modern and the mythic. And so it is ostensibly a mythic story, but the psychology is modern, the politics are modern, the relationships are modern. And I think that is an element that subsequent artists looked at very carefully and took inspiration from, including Joyce, who flips the equation. In Ulysses, it's the modern, the everyday is on the surface, and the mythic is lurking behind. But the kind of the relationship, that kind of doubling, is I think rooted to some extent in Wagner.
I just want to put a word in here that people can start writing questions in your chat. So
David, I mean, what does Wagner mean to you musically? Kind
well,
of speaking, is there anything in Wagner that just sort of helps you do your job?
I have a couple of ideas about Wagner, which are really significant. First of all, I saw Tristan when I was 18 at the San Francisco Opera, and I, bought a standing room ticket, and I stood in the back with my score and my pen light, and then I stapled the ticket to the concert into the score. And I mean, it really, for a composer, it's a real kind of high watermark piece, because it's a piece in which the topic of the piece manifests itself in the way the chords work. So it sort of tells you on every level, from the story level to the actual, functional harmony level, about what the piece is about. And I don't really know of too many other pieces that have that kind of, totality. But I have a totally, perverse composer-centric way of thinking about it, which is that I think composers always have a hard time trying to figure out what our job is in the world. And because, of course, for most of human history, composers were hired to do specific things. We were hired by the church or hired by a nobleman to make music which would be not very interesting, so they could talk over it at dinner, And I taught a class at Yale once called Revolutionary Moments in Music History, and my whole point was that all of the pieces that we study in classical music are pieces that in some way violated the expectations of their commissioners. Because commissioners just tell you, this is what we want from you, right? So if you're going to do anything extra, it's something that you're going to add yourself, and something that you're going to maybe even have to fight for. So to me, one of the great ideas about Wagner, which I think is so interesting, is he really thought that his job as the composer was to take care of every part of his business. He needed to know who his characters were. He needed to write the libretto. He needed to know their total background. He needed to hire everyone. He needed to be involved with every aspect of the production. He needed to invent the way of performing and rehearsing and studying them. He needed to invent the concert hall in the city, which would be the destination where you would only be able to find them. So basically, I love this idea that what you are doing with the piece of music is not sitting at your piano and writing a little tune. You're actually causing this utopian series of events to be called into being. And if you really want them to be successful, and you really want them to have their full effect, you're responsible for every aspect of that chain of being. And I think we got that from Wagner, and to me, I look at someone like Stockhausen, for example, whose life is really sort of like a Wagner parable, or a Wagner, equivalent. And I think he has a giant vision of who he is and what music can do, and what a composer's role in the world can be. And I don't think he got that from composers who lived in a much more disciplined and prescribed way. Bach, most of what he did as, my favorite composer, Bach, the greatest ever, right? He lived in a very prescribed area. He was hired to do things, and occasionally he did a couple things for himself. Most of the time he pretty much stayed inside the lines. Stockhausen didn't do that, right? I think that's kind of like one of Wagner's gifts, is teaching us that being a composer is thinking for yourself how the world needs to change in order to make your work possible.
Right. That's really interesting. I hadn't actually ever quite thought about it that way. Because I mean, the sort of one conventional way of looking at this is to see Wagner as the ultimate megalomaniac, who has to control every aspect, of the operation, because he just won't cede the authority to anyone else, and thinks that he knows better than anyone else, not only about the music and the words, but about the performance style and the acting style, the stage design, and the architecture. In many cases, actually, Wagner did know better than anyone in his milieu about a lot of these things, and the Bayreuth Festspielhaus turned out to be this genius work of theatrical architecture that he didn't design it foot by foot, but the idea, the essential idea for the auditorium, with the sunken orchestra and the amphitheater-like sort of fractional amphitheater seating, with every seat pointing toward the stage, and the double proscenium. It was all his idea. And so, yeah, you can see him as sort of this extreme megalomaniac. I mean, for me, just looking at it biographically, first of all, what I think it was really about was, he was a kid who wanted to make his own shows. He was just that kind of kid who, gathers the family together and has written kind of this little piece of music, and has puppets, and is running around, and is playing an instrument, or has got a couple of other people to play instruments, and he puts in a show, and he's done everything. And Wagner, who was sort of childlike in many ways, he always remained this kind of antic, restless, kind of childlike person, just persisted doing that throughout his life, right to the end, on this grand scale, and somehow made it happen. Just the fact that he finished the Ring cycle, over more than 2 decades, and with certainly a great deal of help from King Ludwig II, managed to present it to the world is just kind of a staggering feat of just practical, getting things done. But the way you put it, I just find that so interesting, because it's not about sort of megalomania or even utopia, really, and sort of making yourself the center of the universe and taking over. It is about finding your own space when the conventional spaces that exist for you are rejecting what you do, or not fit for what you do, and so you do it yourself, and you find your own spaces, you find your own performers. I mean, this is what the spirit of Bang in a Can was about from the beginning. Perhaps this is the first Wagnerian interpretation of Bang in a Can.
It might be. It's a Wagnerian
but the downtown Bayreuth. But yeah, I mean, you and Michael Gordon and Julia Wolf, wrote the music, gathered the performers, found the spaces, did the advertising.
We cleaned the bathrooms afterwards.
Yeah,
too,
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's even beyond Wagner. The Gesamtkonstrukt did not include janitorial.
Our vision is bigger.
So yeah, that's fascinating. That's the kind of thing that you learn from how.
Well, I do think that it's really hard for composers to know what we are supposed to do in the world, and we look at other successful composers in the past to decide, well, yes, well, I'd like to find a patron and, live in the country. I'd like to be Sibelius and, not write for the last 40 years of my life. And, whatever model, you sort of learn how to do it by seeing how everyone else does it. And I think that vision is something that I don't think people knew they could have until he invented it.
Right. Yeah.
We have a question from Julian. Julian, you may unmute yourself.
Oh, hello. Yes, no, I'm just really interested in the fact that the cultural sort of references you refer to actually go outside music so quickly. And I'm sort of intrigued by this and also slightly confused by it, because as we all know, the whole idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the elements of art, design, literature, music within a single production, and the fact that Bayreuth, the theatre was dark, whereas the Paris Opera was lit up and the boxes were visible, and you basically saw society and the opera was going on while you watched. All of that, Wagner turned that around completely. But it seems to me that outside of Bayreuth, there were not that many productions of Wagner operas really before he died. The first productions in Italy were sort of in the the late 1870s, maybe, mainly 1880s, 1890s. So I'm interested, how did his ideas sort of get disseminated? That this whole, were they read? Were they played on the piano? Were they?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting topic. How did people encounter Wagner when the work was not at all ubiquitous? For example, with the French Wagnerites, Wagner himself was in Paris in 1839 to 1842. Very little of his music, just a couple of very tiny things were done. He wanted to do Rienzi in Paris or Flying Dutchman in Paris, and that didn't happen. Then I think there were two performances of the Tannhäuser Overture over the following 2 decades. And then in 1861, there was this notorious scandal of Tannhäuser at the Paris Opera, which there's this sort of huge melee in the audience, a kind of classic Paris culture scandal. And that was the end of Wagner at the Paris Opera until the 1890s. And no other major, but Wagner was not staged again in Paris until 1887, and that was a whole other scandal. Because the nationalist politics and the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War were mixed up in it. So yeah, just you couldn't actually hear Wagner in the conventional way, but you could hear orchestral excerpts at these concerts by conductors like Padelou and Lamoureux, which were huge events, and just sort of all the sort of major cultural figures came to the Lamoureux concerts in particular at the Cirque Napoleon, and so people had to kind of imagine, what the staging was going to look like. And then there were a lot of kind of chamber performances, salon performances with reduced forces, saloniers in Paris putting on a sort of an act of a particular Wagner opera, and Judith Gautier and her puppet productions of Wagner, and just people playing Wagner at the piano. Baudelaire would listen to Villiers de l'Isle Adam play Wagner in a apparently very eccentric, improvisatory kind of manner. And so it was digested in fragments, and people read the writings or read the French translations of the writings, which could be sort of somewhat distant from the original German text, which was incredibly difficult to understand to begin with. So it was already being kind of refracted and sort of multiplied. And yes, people just had to imagine what was going on. They weren't actually seeing stagings. This was less the case. There were more stagings in London, especially once you got to the 1880s, and there was an enormous kind of wave of Wagner performances at the Met starting in 1884. But I think it's telling that people sort of had free rein in their imaginations as they sort of conceived of how these operas sort of would play out in real life. And when Adolf Appia went to Bayreuth to see the operas, he was hugely disappointed because he had these extraordinary, luminous, semi-abstract visions of how Wagner should be staged, and he was crushed to see this sort of heavy, pseudo-naturalist, kind of cluttered decor in a very traditional style, because Wagner actually really lacked imagination as a scenic designer, sort of the whole visual sphere. He just was not nearly as inventive in that sphere. or receptive to other people's inventive ideas. And so Appia began sort of sketching out what should, a perfect Wagner staging look like. How could the staging, the design style sort of catch up with the visionary aspect of the music? And in the process, he becomes one of the pioneers of modernist theater, as he puts those modernist conceptions down on paper. So, so the gap between what was able to be seen and what could be imagined was perhaps part of how this phenomenon took off. And now that we can just go on YouTube and see any Wagner that we want, or sort of listen to anything, that kind of imaginative dimension is not as strong as it once was.
But it's kind of, I think it's really interesting that I mean, who did his PR in a way? Because if you couldn't actually see the work in its completion, were this sort of tantalizing fragments of the music that people heard so sort of extraordinary, I guess, that this whole kind of world of the imagination sort of was lit in all of these different people in different media.
Yeah. Well, that was partly it. That was probably just the music did just jump out at people in this extraordinary way. When Baudelaire went to see Wagner conduct in concert in Paris in 1860, and the Lohengrin prelude started playing, he was just completely obliterated, by the experience. He just hadn't heard anything like it. Sort of even more surprising moments when Auguste de Gasparini was at a spa in Baden-Baden in 1857, I think it was, and there was a little band or orchestra playing the Wedding March from Lohengrin. And for him, somehow this was an overwhelming experience, and he felt sort of destroyed and obliterated by the occult power of the wedding music. It's hard to imagine, but that was how it struck people, So yeah, the orchestral excerpts were the kind of advance guard. They were a form of publicity. Wagner was very torn. On the one hand, he knew how useful it was as publicity. On the other hand, he knew that torn out of context, this music kind of lost so much of its theatrical meaning, and so that troubled him with good reason, because I think, the entry of the gods into Valhalla is completely different when you hear it just sort of played grandly, bombastically by an orchestra, than when you see it at the end of Rheingold in this ironic spectacle of the gods marching to their doom and the Rhine maidens crying down below and Loga laughing. The irony disappears and the context disappears. But nonetheless, it was useful. I mean, Wagner was a brilliant PR guy for his own work, in terms of inventing catchphrases, Gesamtkunstwerk, the artwork of the future, leitmotif, which was not actually a phrase that he came up with, but the concepts that it labeled was, something that he stressed in his writings, and so these so-called theoretical writings spread the word, and just they caused enormous amount of discussion just in and of themselves. Even without people being able to listen to the music, because there were radical ideas and shocking ideas and provocative ideas and horrible ideas. I mean, the Jewishness in music essay was one of them, and it was a kind of form of propaganda. He was trying to knock down two leading composers, Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer, on grounds that they were incapable of being true great composers because they were Jewish, in order to make room for his own transcendent genius. It's particularly with Meyerbeer. Meyerbeer had to be kind of knocked out of the way to make room for Wagnerian opera. So it was, propaganda. It was a kind of a branding exercise. Bayreuth turned into this kind of tourist event with merchandise and, Wagner cigar boxes and statuettes and placemats and beer mugs, and so that Hans Fagioni, Nicholas Fagioni has written a wonderful book about Wagner as brand and about his marketing. Fascinating study.
Thank you.
Do you have any of those beer mats, or can you show us a cigar?
I don't, unfortunately. I do have this is a more modern example. This is a Wagner action figure.
Bendable.
Sent to me, but I mean, I do have sort of examples of this kind of turn of the century Wagnerian kitsch, such as these sort of children's books or kind of young adult Wagner books, sort of the stories retold and boulderized for young people. So here's Wagner's heroines, and these are very amusing to read.
Yeah.
Because they, when they try to describe what's going on in Act 1 of Die Walküre, and they say, Siegmund and Sieglinde loved each other so much, almost as if they were brother and sister.
Yeah, because there's a lot you have to cover up. Yeah.
Right. Or the good ending of Goethe Dämmerung is revised so that both Siegfried and Brunhilde survive, after throwing the ring to the Rhine, and everyone's happy. Happy
ending, right?
So, but these are kind of wonderful sort of Wagnerian kitsch objects of that period, because it was pop culture, as well as quote unquote high culture.
Well, in the keeping with the spirit of happy endings, if there are no more questions, I think it is wonderful that you came to speak to us, and this was really fun. And the book is really fantastic. I have to say, I really enjoyed it. And let's all thank Alex for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I had a wonderful time.
Thank you, Alex. It was absolutely delightful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good luck, everyone, going forward into whatever awaits us.